The hitman came for his head, but they didn't expect the secretary to be deadlier than the boss. It was supposed to be a high society charity gala to announce their fake engagement. But when the Moretti cartel crashes the Pierre Hotel with assault rifles, the party turns into a bloodbath. Gabriel's gun is empty, and a hitman has him dead to rights. That S when his new fiancée steps up, whips out a stiletto blade, and executes the attacker on the spot. The visual data presents the suffocating gloom of a private Manhattan dining room. Icy light from crystal chandeliers fractures across a heavy oak table. Notice the absolute auditory void. Gabriel Castile, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist who constructed a criminal syndicate through blood and cold calculus, grips his glass until the pressure threatens a bone fracture. The subject entering through the imposing doors is not his invisible, submissive assistant. She is draped in heavy emerald silk, moving like the vengeful remnant of a slaughtered bloodline he believed he had surgically eradicated. You and I have likely made this same cognitive error. We disregard the quietest subjects in our periphery, completely failing to recognize that they hold the most ruinous psychological truths about our own fragile existence. Observe the micro-expressions on Gabriel's face. The lighting sculpts his features into a mask of merciless, predatory violence. He did not merely survive the criminal environment. He suffocated it into complete compliance. During daylight, he dominated from a glass enclosure on the 65th floor, dismembering corporations without a spike in his resting heart rate. After dark, he dismantled rival smuggling operations, demanding absolute, terrifying behavioral perfection. A single deviation meant your complete psychological and physical ruin. Yet, a massive cognitive blind spot existed right outside his office for 2 years. This tragic psychological irony is common. We obsessively secure our perimeter against known predators, completely failing to analyze the pathology of the subjects we have already invited inside. The perspective shifts to Clara Hayes, trembling slightly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Within a ruthless syndicate driven by desperate pathological greed, she presented as a frail, submissive shadow permanently affixed to the background. She concealed her physical form in shapeless, tragic garments. Thick corrective lenses and a painfully restricted hairstyle masked her chronic exhaustion, efficiently neutralizing her true, lethal genetic identity. Gabriel kept her in his immediate proximity because her bland invisibility triggered his need for control. He never detected the psychological armor beneath her quiet skin. It is a slow, systemic poison we all ingest. We bury our core psychological profile beneath agonizingly mundane routines for basic survival, but the psyche starves when the mask becomes permanent. Examine her motor control. Her hands remain perfectly steady. Clara operated within the violent chaos like a calibrated instrument of absolute silence. If Gabriel entered the suite at 3 a.m, bleeding onto the rug from a facial laceration, a standard psychological profile would dictate panic. Clara never exhibited a startled response. She simply provided a cold compress, poured heavy single malt, and surgically erased his morning schedule. She presented as a complete emotional void. When Gabriel demanded her presence, she merely adjusted her glasses and complied. Stick with me, because this is where the pathology gets interesting. Subjects who refuse to flinch at sudden destruction are not empty. They have simply survived trauma so profound that chaos becomes their baseline. Gabriel frames himself against the massive window, exhibiting the posture of a doomed monarch observing his burning territory. The physiological dread radiating from his broad shoulders is palpable. Without breaking his focal point, he issues a directive to cancel his flight to Geneva and terminate his schedule for the following evening. Clara processes this without an ocular flinch, inquiring about a pending merger while her pen remains static. Gabriel finally rotates, his pupils dilated with the dark anticipation of absolute ruin. The corporate strategy is dead. Viktor Ivanov has entered New York, guaranteeing a sudden spike in mortality rates. It is a bitter reality of human behavior. Regardless of the defensive layers you construct, your history only requires one structural failure to drag you back to the dirt. Observe closely, and you will detect a microscopic tremor in Clara's pale hand. The ink ceases for a fraction of a second. It is a fatal failure in her psychological armor, and Gabriel's hypervigilant instincts lock onto the movement. He analyzes her, his brow furrowing. Viktor Ivanov is a clinical sadist, and his arrival ensures catastrophic violence. Gabriel states that Ivanov demands a diplomatic dinner, introducing a new partner as a mechanism of psychological warfare. Clara suppresses a massive cortisol spike, smoothly confirming the reservation, while her internal reality shatters. This is the clinical truth of trauma. True resilience is not the absence of fear. Resilience is experiencing complete psychological collapse while keeping your vocal cords perfectly steady. Clara's vocal modulation remains completely flat as she offers to contact Isabella, a subject whose value relies on generational wealth and a vacant psychological profile. Gabriel slices the air, exhibiting the erratic pacing of a confined predator. The acute stress is consuming him. He deduces that Isabella would consume too much alcohol, lose verbal control, and precipitate their execution before the second course. His narcissistic survival instinct demands a stabilizing anchor. He requires a subject whose nervous system will not collapse when firearms are drawn beneath the tablecloth. Gabriel looms over Clara's desk, casting a heavy shadow. When existential threats arise, we never seek the glamorous subjects. We hunt for the traumatized survivors who know exactly how to sit in the dark and wait. Gabriel's ocular fixation pierces directly through Clara's scratched lenses. He states he requires a ghost, a psychological blank slate, who understands the crushing weight of absolute silence. Clara's knuckles blanch against her clipboard. She attempts to deflect, suggesting an agency that procures discreet companions for syndicate engagements. Gabriel decreases the physical distance. Ivanov routinely destroys those subjects for basic neurological stimulation. He requires a companion conditioned by his own psychological fire. He locks onto her dilated pupils, shifting the dynamic into volatile territory. She exhales his name, a genuine tremor betraying her baseline. When you condition yourself to be entirely invisible, you inadvertently forge yourself into the perfect tactical weapon for a pathological narcissist. Clara physically retreats into the shadows, gripping her clipboard as if fiberboard could deflect ballistic trauma. Gabriel has terminated his civilized executive facade, dictating her attendance as an absolute imperative. Clara experiences acute vocal constriction, pleading that she lacks the behavioral armor necessary to survive such a lethal environment. She warns that a psychopath like Ivanov will interpret her unpolished presentation as a deliberate insult. Gabriel offers zero emotional regulation. He extracts his titanium card, sliding it across the mahogany until it contacts her trembling fingers. He orders a complete aesthetic transformation. We construct comfortable psychological enclosures, ignorant that eventually a dominant force will shatter the perimeter and drag us into the blinding exposure of reality. Gabriel is not seeking fragile aesthetics. He is requisitioning a conditioned combatant cloaked in premium textiles. A severe panic response escalates within Clara's physiological system. For 24 months, she used severe garments to suppress the catastrophic trauma of her genetic lineage. Proximity to a predator like Ivanov threatens to dismantle her constructed persona and expose the violent history of her bloodline. She begs the megalomaniac to select an alternate target. His response is a vocalization entirely devoid of empathy. It is a strict mandate. You and I are going to look at this together and decide. You can bury your historical trauma beneath layers of denial, but unresolved psychological variables never truly decay. They remain dormant, waiting to trigger a catastrophic failure. The narcissistic demand reverberates in Clara's chest as she breaches the glass perimeter of an elite commercial environment. The climate-controlled air carries olfactory markers of crushed flora and generational narcissism. A polished sales associate named Genevieve walks across the marble. Her visual assessment registers acute contempt, categorizing Clara's degraded textiles as severe social failures. The associate weaponizes artificial courtesy to inflict psychological discomfort. We observe this clinical error constantly. Individuals frequently evaluate a subject's value based strictly on material presentation. They operate with total blindness to the probability that the exhausted subject before them possesses the precise trauma profile required to entirely dismantle their fragile reality. The focus isolates the arrogant asymmetry of Genevieve's facial expression. She clinically informs Clara that the facility rejects lower socioeconomic brackets, but Clara has maintained baseline respiration while staring down active firearms. The microaggressions of a retail employee fail to register on her regulated nervous system. Operating with pathological calm, Clara extracts Gabriel's titanium card, accelerating it against the glass display case with a concussive impact. The atmosphere of social superiority instantly evaporates. Genevieve's affect collapses into physiological panic as she babbles about private suites. This is a quantifiable psychological fact. Authentic power never elevates its decibel level. Clara processes the terrified civilian as a mere object, extracting the requisite armor for an engagement with apex predators. Enter this isolated suite with me, and let us observe the mechanics of self-destruction. The stylist exhibits elevated cortisol, asking for her color preference. Clara bypasses all hesitation. She selects emerald green. It is a statistically fatal choice. That color was the visual signature of the Romano organization, violently eradicated 36 months prior. For years, Clara suppressed her core identity, functioning as Gabriel's dependent to survive. Displaying emerald now is the behavioral equivalent of inviting a ballistic execution. Yet, the traumatized subject refuses to submit. You can incinerate the records of your trauma, but the psychological imprints within your neurochemistry are permanent. If forced to dine with sociopaths, she will manifest the armor of her dead lineage. Let us open this case file together, you and I, and examine the phenomena of behavioral masking. We observe the subject, Clara, paralyzed before a mirror as a stylist orders the dismantling of her disguise. She is drowning in thick lenses and shapeless fabrics, a calculated shell chosen to conceal the coiled musculature of a trauma survivor. She rationalizes her spiking cortisol, promising her racing pulse this exposure is strictly for one evening. With trembling fingers, she extracts the hidden pins. A heavy waterfall of dark chestnut crashes over her shoulders and the timid secretive facade disintegrates into clinical dust. The stylist gasps, genuinely breathless. We must remember that the heaviest psychological burden we carry is the fabricated persona. The authentic self will invariably claw its way back to the light. Clara elevates her hands and methodically strips away those suffocating glasses, abandoning them on the vanity edge. The observer, Genevieve, emits a sharp, involuntary gasp. Unobstructed, Clara presents lethal amber eyes, burning with the unspeakable, unprocessed grief of a ruined queen above dangerously sharp cheekbones. The submissive secretary evaporates instantly. In her place sits a terrifying, cold elegance that clinically suffocates the oxygen in the room. The stylist begins to psychologically unravel, desperate to comprehend why a subject would intentionally bury such staggering aesthetic power. Clara offers no reciprocal warmth, no pacifying excuse. She merely fixates on her reflection with chilling, calm. Take note of this defense mechanism. Individuals will frequently veil their most brilliant attributes simply to insulate a fragile, damaged psyche. 2 agonizing hours bleed into the clinical shadows, finalizing the transformation. Clara analyzes the tall glass, and for a fractional heartbeat, genuine psychological terror flashes across her features. The specimen in the reflection is not the conditioned assistant. It is Clarissa Romano, the phantom heiress of a systematically eradicated empire. She is poured into a devastating emerald silk gown, binding her waist before tearing open along her pale thigh, a masterpiece of pure predatory danger. Her dark hair is sculpted into calculated waves. She mimics a doomed siren, meticulously preparing to mentally dissect the narcissists who slaughtered her bloodline. The clinical takeaway is written in the rigid posture of her spine. You can wrap an apex predator in sheepskin, but the primal claws remain endlessly starved. They systematically paint over her unvocalized trauma with a smoky shadow and a dark crimson lip that telegraphs absolute hostility. Staring back from the vanity is the undeniable physiology of a soul survivor. Right on schedule, the environmental stressor jersey hits. Gabriel issues a harsh text demanding urgency. Clara inhales a ragged breath, suppressing her autonomic panic deep within her ribcage. She steps into towering black heels, the red soles perfectly matching the arterial blood tone of her lips. She secures a dark velvet clutch, compartmentalizing her phone, her cosmetics, and a custom titanium blade. She pushes out into the freezing night, a weaponized entity wrapped in silk. We must listen closely to this empirical truth. A symmetrically beautiful face has never once altered the trajectory of a speeding bullet. Down on the freezing pavement, a fortified vehicle idles in the dark, and Gabriel's enforcer, Matteo, leans against the rear panel, aggressively self-medicating with nicotine. Matteo processes the rhythmic auditory stimulus of her heels and rotates his head. The cigarette literally detaches from his paralyzed lips. His primitive cortex takes over, his hand twitching instinctively toward the concealed firearm in his coat. It is the raw, unconditioned reflex of a violent operative. He detects an apex predator entering his territorial grid, entirely forgetting his designated role as her protector. He chokes out a ragged whisper. Clara simply offers him the ghostly micro-expression of a tragic smile. Observe this phenomenon closely. When an individual weaponizes their psychological scars, they immediately command the entire environment. Let us pause and analyze this interaction, you and I. Matteo is undergoing a neurological malfunction, nodding blindly as he pulls open the heavy door. Clara slides into the dark back seat, where the megalomaniac narcissist, Gabriel, sits waiting. He is swirling amber bourbon, his hyper-vigilant eyes locked onto a screen. Displaying classic narcissistic devaluation, he snaps a cruel remark about her being 2 minutes late without breaking visual contact with his device. And then he finally looks up. The expensive tablet slips from his failing motor control, crashing onto the floorboards. The untouchable, violent kingpin is entirely paralyzed. Let this be a clinical lesson to us all. If you wish to mentally break a powerful adversary, you must allow them to feel perfectly arrogant first. The atmospheric pressure inside that armored cabin suddenly turns thick enough to induce asphyxiation. Gabriel, the brutal mastermind who clinically dissects grown men, experiences acute respiratory distress. He is completely drowning in the visual stimuli of her crimson lips, the plunging silk, and those haunting amber eyes. Clara deliberately terminates her submissive, high-pitched secretary vocal patterns. She replaces them with a low, stabilized tone, casually inquiring if they plan to sit in this alley indefinitely. Gabriel swallows hard, his jaw clenching as a violent surge of possessive jealousy floods his nervous system, a massive cognitive dissonance regarding a woman he intentionally marginalized for 2 years. It is a bitter, inescapable, psychological reality. You cannot intellectually regulate who your damaged subconscious bleeds for. We must observe the aggressive shift in power dynamics here. Gabriel finally bypasses his shock-induced paralysis, aggressively barking at Matteo to drive. As yellow streetlights illuminate the cabin, Gabriel sits, rigid, actively spiraling into acute obsession. For 24 months, he utilized her as a depreciated asset, invisible furniture in his grandiosity. Now, his hyperfixation locks onto the frantic pulse beating against her bare collarbone. But Clara remains an absolute emotional glacier. She displays no nervous displacement behaviors, no adjusting of the dress, no averting her gaze. She simply radiates the terrifying, grounded energy of a subject reclaiming total autonomy. Here is a psychological truth for anyone feeling chronically unseen. Authentic confidence is completely silent. She shifts the entire relational axis without moving a single muscle. Through the low-frequency hum of the engine, Gabriel breaches her personal space, his voice dropping to an interrogative whisper. He accuses her of engaging in a fatally destructive game, demanding to know what behavioral conditioning taught her to suppress her core identity so efficiently. Clara does not register a single micro-flinch. She stares directly into the psychopathic void of his eyes and counters that primal survival is the most agonizing instructor. She addresses him as Mr. Castile, but the formal honorific is delivered like a synthesized neurotoxin from blood-red lips. He lets out a dark laugh, confess that had he profiled the weaponized entity beneath her facade, he would never have permitted her proximity. We see the clinical application clearly here. Concealing your deepest traumas and highest variables is the ultimate psychological manipulation. Clara does not miss a single conversational beat, maintaining a sociopathic baseline as she whispers that her optical camouflage served its exact purpose. Her amber eyes project a calculated defiance just as the armored transport decelerates. Matteo, still visibly dysregulated, manages to pull the heavy door open into the bitter elements. Clara emerges onto the pavement with the deadly, fluid kinesiology of a starving panther. Gabriel quickly secures his dark jacket, his paranoid survival instincts violently signaling that he has been usurped as the apex threat in the environment. He offers her his arm, and the millisecond her bare skin grazes his sleeve, his entire nervous system locks into solid stone. This is the physiological reality of limbic resonance. True, dark chemistry bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely, impacting the subject like a stray bullet. Gerard, a man systematically conditioned to service high-value targets without a fluctuation in heart rate, completely loses his cognitive grounding. His socially engineered smile fractures for a full second before his training kicks in, bowing to whisper that she is breathtaking. Gabriel instantly registers a sickening, violent spike of territorial rage. He aggressively presses his hand against the exposed lumbar curve of Clara's spine, the thermal feedback of her skin triggering severe possessive ideation. He issues a guttural command to secure the private sector immediately, driven by a primitive urge to physically isolate her from the predatory visual sweep of the room. It is a predictable, tragic behavioral flaw of our species. The exquisite, damaged elements we try so desperately to quarantine are precisely what the greedy world seeks to consume. Follow me closely through this next sequence. Gabriel and Clara navigate the dim corridor. While a civilian would be distracted by the chandeliers, Gabriel observes her hyper-vigilant eye movements. She is systematically indexing fire exits, analyzing the biomechanics of the waitstaff, and calculating the blunt force potential of a brass vase. She is mentally simulating a mass casualty event. Gabriel constricts his grip on her waist, his heart rate accelerating violently as he attempts to profile the calculated monster operating beneath her flawless exterior. They push through the heavy oak doors into a room that practically radiates the metallic scent of impending violence. At the apex of the table sits Viktor Ivanov, a heavily scarred sociopath. You and I both know the clinical reality here. The most silent subjects in a volatile environment are inherently the most lethal. Positioned adjacent to Victor is Katerina, visibly suffocating under the weight of compensatory diamonds. Flanking them are two enforcers, their movements betraying hidden steel. Victor projects an artificially inflated ego, his arrogant laughter booming as he consumes his drink. But the millisecond Gabriel and Clara penetrate the perimeter, that manufactured bravado completely ceases. The auditory void becomes a suffocating force. Victor's predatory gaze detaches from Gabriel entirely and locks onto Clara, his jaw slackening in an unfiltered lapse of executive function. Beside him, Katerina experiences a severe spike in cortisol, her eyes narrowing with acute territorial jealousy. This dynamic serves as a vital diagnostic baseline. Material compensation can never manufacture genuine loyalty, and one must never tether their self-concept to a narcissist's wandering fixation. Let us open this clinical file and examine the baseline tension. Even the guards display micro-expressions of acute stress. Gabriel projects primal, territorial aggression, drawing Clara into his physical space to broadcast an unspoken boundary. He delivers a surgically cold apology. However, the subject, Victor, exhibits the textbook pathology of a megalomaniac narcissist. Completely devoid of standard social inhibition, Victor anchors a predatory stare onto Clara. He openly insults Gabriel's previous companions, attempting to establish dominance through deliberate provocation. You and I must understand the pathology at play here. The specific manner in which an aggressor assesses the vulnerable individual standing beside you will always reveal the exact depth of their own internal depravity. Victor attempts to destabilize the dynamic with a provocation about Gabriel's former partner. Gabriel refuses the psychological bait, methodically seating Clara and classifying her strictly as an associate. Victor manipulates the term like a stolen trophy. Invading their spatial perimeter, he questions what a subordinate actually contributes to a criminal syndicate. Clara does not exhibit a single autonomic stress response. Her pulse remains dead calm. She maintains unbroken eye contact, stating she executes operational perfection and personally eliminates structural complications. Victor barks a dismissive laugh, failing to recognize the absolute zero in her tone. It confirms a lethal behavioral metric. Minimizing the most silent entity in a volatile room is the most efficient method of orchestrating your own demise. Classifying Clara as a volatile asset, Victor issues a veiled threat regarding the Baltimore transit sectors. The elaborate culinary offerings are irrelevant. The atmospheric pressure in the room is suffocating. Gabriel attempts cognitive diplomacy, resisting Victor's escalating financial demands. Yet, internally, Gabriel is actively suppressing a severe violent impulse. Each time Victor directs his megalomaniac fixation toward Clara, Gabriel wages a neurological war against his own limbic system, fighting the primitive urge to draw his sidearm and paint the walls. We see this pattern often in maximum security wards. Maintaining rigid impulse control when an antagonist deliberately triggers your deepest psychological vulnerabilities remains the most excruciating yet essential survival mechanism. Step inside this clinical observation with me. Clara operates on a superior cognitive plane while these men engage in primitive dominance displays. She consumes small portions, yet her ocular tracking is relentless. Gabriel recognizes her intense vigilance, a calculated adjustment of a crystal glass, utilizing the reflective surface to monitor hostile shifts in the peripheral shadows. Gabriel verbally severs the tension, labeling his demand for 40% as pure delusion. He states that labor factions bleed only for currency, not hollow coercion. The megalomaniac smirk dissolves into a flat, reptilian hostility. This illustrates a foundational behavioral principle. Authentic psychological dominance never requires elevation of volume. It merely requires ruthless, unblinking observation. Hostility escalates as Victor projects his insecurities, claiming Gabriel's organization has deteriorated. Then, the secondary subject, Katerina, interferes, exhibiting the traits of a narcissistic extension. She verbally diminishes Gabriel, suggesting he limit himself to expensive suits and displaying ornamental females. The sudden acoustic void is deafening. It is a catastrophic cognitive error. Gabriel experiences an acute stress freeze, his grip turning bone white on his knife. The physiological markers of imminent violence are staggering. But milliseconds before his cortex abandons restraint, Clara methodically dabs her mouth and intercepts the aggression. It proves a constant behavioral flaw. Allowing an unchecked ego to dictate your speech frequently aligns you in the crosshairs of an apex predator. Observe the mechanics of this psychological dismantling. Clara transitions into clinical hostility. Her vocal cadence is synthetically sweet, functioning as razor wire. She targets Katerina's vanity by praising her necklace. Blinded by narcissism, Katerina eagerly consumes the bait. Clara then executes the cognitive strike. She softly remarks on the utility of heavy diamonds, noting how effectively they camouflage the fresh, intravenous drug abrasions on Katerina's left forearm. The emotional devastation is instantaneous. Katerina's vascular system constricts in panic. Victor's megalomaniac facade shatters. He detonates in secondary rage, striking the wood. It is a clinical certainty. Before initiating an assault against others, you must ensure your own behavioral history is entirely sanitized. The glassware vibrates from Victor's kinetic outburst as enforcers close the perimeter. Gabriel instantly drops into a primal fight response. Beneath the table, he operates with lethal efficiency, disengaging the safety of his pistol and issuing a guttural directive for Victor to remain seated. Yet, Clara exhibits the most fascinating pathology. She displays an absolute absence of the human startle reflex. Her posture remains perfectly aligned, anchoring her pupils directly onto the raging megalomaniac. She shifts into a state of profound dominance, coldly instructing him to disarm his men. It reinforces a stark neurological fact. Genuine authority is never demonstrated by acoustic volume. It belongs to the mind that can process imminent trauma without a single fluctuation in heart rate. Clara weaponizes linguistics with surgical precision. She deploys an extremely violent dialect exclusive to apex criminal elements in Moscow. Gabriel masks his cognitive dissonance, processing a skill he cannot logically explain. We watch Victor's psychological framework collapse. The rapid drainage of blood from his face indicates a massive cortisol dump. Stripped of his narcissistic armor, he regresses into terror, pleading for her identity. Clara offers zero empathetic regulation. In a flat cadence, she calculates she will sever his carotid artery with a concealed blade before a single ballistic discharge occurs. This is an exquisite demonstration of tactical suppression. The most devastating trauma is inflicted when a deeply concealed capability is suddenly deployed with catastrophic leverage. You and I must analyze this transfer of power. Clara recalibrates to English without a microsecond of cognitive delay. She elevates her glass and dictates new parameters, severely restricting Victor's claims. With a casual sip, she presents a binary outcome. She demands he accept subjugation or face immediate biological termination. Victor experiences complete system failure, desperately seeking a psychological anchor in Gabriel. But Gabriel exhibits advanced executive function. Concealing his own disorientation, he adopted a state of rigid passivity, recognizing the necessity of absolute silence. The clinical takeaway is absolute. When an allied organism operating at an apex predatory level dominates the environment, the optimal survival strategy is complete behavioral withdrawal. As the threat subsides, Victor exhibits severe autonomic distress. He hyperventilates, trembling as he signals his enforcers to disengage. Clara projects a simulated smile, though her gaze remains devoid of warmth. She asks about dessert, a sociopathic technique to normalize recent psychological abuse. Beneath the table, Gabriel systematically releases his firearm. A paradigm shift fractures his reality. He categorizes her not as a docile subordinate, but as a heavily conditioned anomaly. He detects her olfactory signature, a deceptive vanilla masking the residue of dormant violence. This provides a chilling behavioral axiom. The subjects who present the most harmless exteriors are statistically the ones harboring the most catastrophic psychological architectures. Sit with me and observe the deterioration of this alliance. Gabriel initiates a profound spatial invasion, occupying her immediate proximity. He delivers a low auditory threat layered with suppressed territorial rage, guaranteeing a brutal interrogation regarding her genuine identity. Clara attempts a dissociative stare through the glass, mimicking emotional detachment. However, observation reveals a faint tremor in her digits. Her elaborate dissociative barriers are experiencing structural failure. The violent precipitation against the armored glass mirrors the severe emotional turbulence contained within the vehicle. The psychological conclusion here is absolute. The subject may bury their trauma beneath fabricated identities for decades, but the subconscious mind will invariably remember its origin. Gabriel remains locked in an acute state of extreme fixation. He processes a volatile cocktail of cognitive betrayal and the initial symptoms of traumatic bonding, a dangerous gravity pulling him toward his antagonist. Harsh artificial light maps the rigid tension across her face. The psychological reality is total. The benign persona has been eradicated. The entity in the adjacent seat is a foreign predator capable of dismantling organized violence with terrifying fluency. Clara maintains her rigid baseline, fingers guarding her concealed weapon. This forces a disturbing introspective analysis. We convince ourselves that psychological architecture is constructed to repel external threats. In truth, we build these fortresses solely to contain the fragmented pathology trapped within ourselves. Let's open this case file together, shall we? We begin by observing Gabriel. Clinically speaking, he is exhibiting the classic rage of a fractured narcissist. He watches his subject frantically try to stitch her harmless persona back together. But the psychological construct is dead. The car glides into the concrete belly of his high-rise. Gabriel refuses to wait for the driver, shoving the heavy door open into the freezing garage. He offers her no hand. His jaw locks like stone as he orders her into his private elevator. She says absolutely nothing, walking like a condemned prisoner into the glass box that shoots them into the dark sky. We see a fundamental behavioral truth here. Once a pathological lie is exposed to the harsh light, the safety of the dark is gone forever. You can never go back to pretending. The glass elevator climbs higher, dragging them up into a freezing silence where the oxygen feels painfully thin. The steel doors slide open, revealing his massive penthouse. The lighting is terribly cold. From a behavioral standpoint, the space functions much more like a marble tomb than a home. Black floors stretch out like a frozen lake, while thick glass holds back the glittering teeth of the city. Gabriel marches straight to his bar, fueled entirely by narcissistic injury and blind rage. He pours 2 glasses of dark liquor, but keeps both firmly trapped in his own hands. It proves a quiet, crushing lesson about human dominance. The individual who dictates the smallest comforts in a room will always hold the psychological leash. Gabriel slowly sheds his coat. The heavy wool falls to the floor like dead skin, a physical shedding of restraint. Moving with a calculated slowness, he unclips his holster. The cold steel of his weapons slams hard against the marble counter, cracking through the room like a gunshot. It is a wordless, brutal assertion of spatial dominance. He orders her to drink. Clara stays glued to the spot, displaying the textbook freeze response of trauma. Against the suffocating dark tones of the penthouse, her green dress shimmers like a warning sign. She never flinches at the gun, refusing to look at the glass. She merely absorbs the agonizing silence. This offers a deeply humbling lesson for our own lives. True, terrifying power never needs to scream. It simply lays its weapons down and waits for you to blink first. Notice the ambient lighting in this environment. Cold blue neon bleeds through the glass, catching the violent tremor Clara desperately attempts to suppress. She looks at him, trying to play the polite secretary, turning down a drink, desperately attempting to rebuild her shattered baseline. She forces a smile, mentions grabbing a cab, and promises to be at her desk by dawn. Gabriel just lets out a hollow laugh that sucks the air out of the room. He takes a slow drag of his whiskey, his dark eyes locking onto her with the cold patience of an apex predator. He questions if she truly believes there is a desk left for her to return to, stepping directly into her space. It proves a brutal but honest lesson about survival. Once you strip off your mask and show the world your true face. Your old disguise will never fit you again. Gabriel stops a mere 2 feet away. His broad shoulders block out the skyline, plunging Clara entirely into his shadow. A classic tactic of physical intimidation. We observe the heavy tension as he methodically tears down her psychological defenses. He whispers, asking if she really plans to wear her fake reading glasses and play the quiet girl. He is close enough to catch the scent of jasmine buried under her cold sweat. Step by step, he lists her behavioral anomalies from tonight. The way she stared down a Russian boss. The flawless street slang. How she played his guards for total fools. Clara holds her ground, but the frantic pulse hammering in her throat betrays her autonomic nervous system. It points to a simple, undeniable fact of life. You can easily hide your ordinary flaw, but true dangerous talent will always bleed into the open. Clara tries to hold her ground, whispering that she was only smoothing over a minor complication. That single word shatters his megalomaniacal control. Gabriel breaks the quiet with a roar of unfiltered rage. A sound so violently raw, her entire body flinches in shock. His heavy hand clamps down onto her bare shoulder. The burning heat of his palm clashes against the freezing air of the room, his fingers digging in tight to lock her in place. The clinical agony burning behind his dark eyes is unmistakable. He leans in inches away, snarling that for 2 long years she held the keys to his secret accounts and his darkest sins. It forces us to swallow a very hard lesson about interpersonal connection. Trusting someone feels warm, but handing a total stranger the loaded gun of your deepest secrets will always end in tragedy. Gabriel calls her a walking lie, sleeping right at the center of his empire. Then the behavioral profile shifts abruptly. His thumb slowly brushes across her collarbone, a touch so shockingly gentle it triggers a painful catch in her throat. He demands to know who sent her. Interpol? A rival family? That accusation shatters her compliant facade. Clara drops the mask, shoving both hands hard against his chest, but he remains an immovable object of authority. She fires back, her voice shaking with raw, desperate anger. She swears she is no rat, screaming that she only hid inside his operation because his shadow was the only place dark enough to keep her alive. It shows a grim reality about human survival mechanisms. Total, blinding desperation will make a person knock on the devil's front door just to ask for a secure place to sleep. Gabriel narrows his eyes, scanning her terrified gaze for micro-expressions of deception. He demands to know what specific threat could possibly induce this level of acute paranoia. Stick with me, because the entire psychological dynamic shifts right here. The fight completely drains out of Clara. She turns to the bright skyline she used to utilize as a shield, her voice dropping to a broken whisper. She confesses she is running from the men who slaughtered her family. Instantly, Gabriel's iron grip loosens. You can almost see his cognitive processing, pulling up years of street intelligence to verify the trauma in her story. It serves as a haunting reminder we all forget too often. Every single person you walk past is fighting a heavy, quiet war you know absolutely nothing about. He is finally seeing the wounded child beneath her armor. Gabriel leans in closer, the shadows casting sharp angles across his face. His voice drops to a rough whisper as he demands her true identity. Clara finally meets his eyes, her dissociative walls completely stripped away. She takes a slow, shaking breath and absolutely destroys the ground beneath him. She tells him her name is Clarissa Romano. A suffocating silence instantly floods the cold penthouse. Gabriel actually stumbles backward, taking the brutal weight of that name right in the chest like a physical trauma. He stares at her, looking as though a bleeding ghost just manifested on his floors. In their violent environment, Romano is pure royalty written in blood. It brings us back to a profound, unshakable truth about life itself. Your past will always hunt you down. You can burn your old clothes and run forever, but you can never escape your own blood. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? You and I both know that criminal power is a psychological illusion, but this history reshapes the entire analysis. For 50 years, the Romano family held Chicago in an absolute chokehold. But 3 winters ago, the Moretti syndicate moved in. On a freezing night in February, they butchered the entire Romano bloodline in one calculated sweep. Boss, sons, soldiers, all gone. The media diagnosed it as a tragic gang war, but the underworld knew it was total genetic extinction. Everyone thought that specific lineage was turned to dust. It leaves us with a painful lesson we should all remember. No personal or professional fortress stands forever. You can hold the entire world in your hands today and be wiped out by tomorrow morning. Comfort is the silent, deadly killer of any empire. Gabriel simply stands there, processing the heavy cognitive dissonance of her name. He recalls that the youngest Romano daughter was supposed to be safely locked away in London. Clarissa lets out a dark laugh, the sound scraping against the quiet room, like a symptom of chronic grief. She explains she was flying home for her father's birthday, but a severe storm grounded her flight. By the time she landed, her entire family had been wiped off the earth. Gabriel stares at her as the jagged pieces of her trauma violently snap together. Her enemies had placed a $5 million bounty on her head. It proves a wild point about environmental fate. Sometimes, the annoying delay that ruins your afternoon is actually just the universe pulling you out of the line of fire. A simple, frustrating delay can easily save your life. Clarissa slowly lifts her chin, the pale light illuminating the empty pride of a seasoned survivor. She tells him directly that those men are still actively hunting her. She required a fortified environment where those predators would never dare step foot. Gabriel's expression goes pitch black as the ugly reality of her manipulation sets in. She selected his organization with clinical purpose. She admits her cold strategy out loud. His syndicate was the only structure intimidating enough to deter her enemies. She hid behind his security, quietly turning his operatives into her personal shield. Gabriel snarls, spitting out the fact that she used him. But staying alive is a deeply ugly business. When your actual life is on the line, ethical boundaries evaporate. True survival means doing absolutely whatever it takes to wake up tomorrow. The subject, Clarissa, exhibits a classic trauma response, firing back with a sudden surge of defensive adrenaline. She rationalizes her deception, screaming that her metrics were flawless. She doubled his revenue and caught the thieves he missed. But Gabriel, showing the volatile rage of a megalomaniac narcissist, utterly snaps. He yells that she is a massive security breach, crossing the room to pin her hard against the glass. The cold abyss of the city glitters behind her spine as he studies her jumping pulse. It is a harsh truth to swallow, but hard work never repairs a foundation built on a lie. You can be the sharpest mind in the room, but if your shadow brings a storm, no good deed erases the fatal threat you carry. Let us examine this interaction closely. Gabriel slams his heavy hands against the freezing glass, completely caging his prey. His breath ghosts over her trembling face as he snarls about the danger she dragged into his carefully controlled domain. If the cartel uncovers her identity, they will firebomb his clubs and ignite a street war. Pressed flat against the pain, Clarissa feels her heart hammer wildly against her ribs. She gasps that nobody knows she is here. Gabriel roars back that Viktor Ivanov absolutely knows. The tragedy of the human condition is that we never truly control the ripple effects of our secrets. You might think your ghosts are contained in the dark, but one tiny slip can cause a tidal wave that drowns everyone around you. Gabriel coldly lays out the brutal reality of her pathology. The Russian boss watched her move like a trained killer, hearing her use elite syndicate slang in a high-pressure moment. It is only a matter of hours before he matches her face to the dead Romano princess and sells that intel to the cartel. Clarissa catches her breath sharply. For the first time, pure panic flashes in her dark eyes. She frantically promises to flee the country so she does not bring a bloody war to his front door. The lesson here is as heavy as lead. Pride will always be your most expensive mistake. She wanted to show off her lethal skills for just one single minute, and that fleeting ego trip cost her the only safe haven she had left. You and I must look closely at this psychological shift. Gabriel stares at her trembling red lips and the terrified pulse jumping in her neck. He sees how that ruined emerald silk clings to her slender frame. A violent, irrational, possessive instinct, a hallmark of his narcissistic need to control, claws its way up his throat. She is a walking target who could easily burn his criminal empire to ashes. Yet he knows with terrifying certainty she is not walking out that door. He drops his voice into a dark whisper, warning her the Russians will hunt her down. The beautiful, chaotic truth of life is this: we do not choose who we feel fiercely protective over. The heart simply decides, and all logic flies out the window the second you truly care about someone. The physical space tells a profound story of captivity. Gabriel pins Clarissa against the cold glass, violating her personal zone to assert dominance. He tells her if the Morettas find her, she is practically a ghost in a week, so he leans in, whispering by her ear, and drops a twisted line about a promotion. By morning, bright sun floods his expensive penthouse. Clarissa has been awake all night, pacing relentlessly around this huge room full of white silk and cold steel. The seeds of Stockholm Syndrome are already being planted. It is supposed to be a secure safe house, but as she stares out at the waking city below, it feels exactly like a high-altitude prison cell. It proves that true freedom is a state of mind, not just a physical location. The massive mahogany door is locked tight, and his heavy hitter has been standing guard all night. Clarissa could see his shadow creeping under the doorframe. Suddenly, the deadbolt clicks, and her blood turns to ice. In walks Gabriel, trading his sharp tuxedo for a dark charcoal suit, appearing dangerously relaxed. He holds 2 steaming mugs of coffee, completely flipping the established script. For 2 straight years, she handed him his morning brew like clockwork. Now, the megalomaniac king of the New York underworld is playing room service. It is a striking visual reminder that the roles we play in life can flip in a single heartbeat. When the power dynamic shifts so drastically, you simply have to adapt to survive the new reality. Clarissa still wears that stunning green gown, but it is completely wrecked. The silk hem is torn from her pacing like a caged animal. Yet, she looks absolutely captivating in her raw desperation. Gabriel sets her coffee on the glass table, taking a slow sip. He murmurs it is black with 2 sugars, a calculated display of his obsessive observation. She refuses to play his game, angrily accusing him of kidnapping her. Gabriel leans against the door and calmly corrects her, calling it a quarantine. Then he drops the bomb that he spent the night here tearing apart her fake life. It teaches us a brutal Lesson: you can never build a sturdy, lasting future on a foundation of forged paper and fragile lies. Gabriel explains his intelligence team ran a deep background check on her fake identity. He asks what they found, and she bitterly admits they found nothing. Gabriel lists off her fake social security number and the forged birth certificate from a conveniently burned down town. Her digital history was so painfully boring, it practically screamed witness protection. He warns her that her expensive cover is completely cooked. The Russian boss is already making calls, and soon the Bratva will know exactly who she really is. Clarissa begs him to let her go, desperate to avoid dragging his syndicate into a bloody war. We learn a fascinating truth here. Flawless perfection is often the biggest red flag of all, because a real human life is always messy. Gabriel shuts that escape plan down instantly, his voice commanding absolute obedience. He steps right up to her, closing the distance until they are mere inches apart. You can practically feel the psychopathic danger radiating off him. He explains Victor is furious over some drama at the Baltimore ports. If the Russian boss figures out Gabriel is hiding the last Romano heir, he will launch a full-scale assault on his empire. Clarissa looks terrified, feeling like a dead woman walking. But then, Gabriel goes completely soft. His massive hand reaches out, gently cupping her pale face like she is made of fragile glass. It is a stark reminder that the most dangerous individuals often harbor the most surprising, quiet tenderness. Let us freeze the frame and analyze this moment together. This vulnerability is a ghost in their violent world. Gabriel is a lethal weapon, yet he treats her with terrifying gentleness, swearing she will survive. The illusion is dead, and the real Clarissa Romano is stepping into the light. She pulls back, eyes wide with panic, knowing her enemies will unleash a wave of killers. But where Gabriel tilts his head, a predatory smile carving his jaw. His megalomania demands a challenge. He wants them to try breaking against his artillery. He will hide her right out in the open. When she breathes out, asking how, his fingers draw a dark blue velvet box from his coat. It teaches us a simple truth. Sometimes the most brazen move is your only path to survival. We observe the heavy quiet of the room. Every breath sounds like thunder. Inside the velvet box rests 10 carats of flawless diamond, secured in cold platinum. The jewel catches the dim light, casting fractured rainbows across the dark. Clarissa stops breathing entirely. Gabriel steps closer, his voice dropping into a possessive, gravelly whisper. He tells her the only way to protect a priceless thing is to own it completely, a classic symptom of his narcissistic pathology. The rival cartels bow to old blood rules. Killing a foot soldier means nothing, but touching a boss's wife demands absolute apocalypse. It forces us to realize a difficult lesson. In this unforgiving life, hiding will only get you buried. You must step forward and let them see your fire. Let us look closely at the psychological tragedy unfolding before us. Clarissa stares at the heavy stone, desperately calculating the angles. She prays he wants a convenient lie, a fake engagement, but Gabriel crushes that hope into dust. He demands a public blood oath, broadcast to every enemy watching from the dark. Slowly, he takes her left hand. His grip is unyielding iron, leaving no room for retreat. The platinum slides onto her finger, a perfect, terrifying fit. In her traumatized mind, it feels exactly like a rusted padlock snapping shut. She is entering the first stage of Stockholm Syndrome. This is the bitter cost of her sanctuary. It deeply reminds us that absolute safety is never free. Every shelter will always demand a piece of your spirit. Observe the subject, Clarissa, forcing her gaze from the diamond to Gabriel. Her physiological response is immediate, a visceral freeze. In his stare, we find the textbook presentation of a megalomaniac narcissist. He knows the quiet assistant is dead, and he intends to consume the traumatized survivor. When she whispers her defiance, asking what happens if she refuses, he employs tactical proximity. Leaning in, he softly states she cannot walk away. He positions himself as her only lifeboat in deep water. The clinical takeaway is universally grim. Survival rarely arrives as gentle salvation. Most of the time, it manifests as a beautifully constructed cage. By morning, their engagement floods the city, throwing the financial sector and the underworld into absolute panic. You and I have studied cases like this before, watching the social machinery grind when an apex predator claims a partner. The public hysteria is entirely predictable. Tabloids tear through the streets, hungry for data on the woman who supposedly pacified him. Yet Gabriel releases only one vague statement. It is a masterclass in psychological torture. He dangles a single piece of bait, calmly observing his rivals choke on their own paranoia. 3 nights later, he sets his trap at a lavish gala inside the Pierre Hotel. This grand room is suffocating with corrupt politicians and syndicate leaders. The atmosphere is saturated with latent violence. This proves a vital behavioral truth. The most devastating message you can ever deliver to a hostile enemy is total, impenetrable silence. This gilded ballroom functions as the altar where he intends to debut his captive queen. Clarissa stands before a towering mirror, observing the dissociation in her own eyes. The docile girl from 3 days ago has vanished. Tonight, she is armed for psychological warfare. She wears midnight velvet that grips her anatomy like a second skin. Falling away to expose her bare spine, a heavy diamond choker rests like ice against her throat, accentuating the predatory angles of her face. She looks entirely lethal. We must remember that our most effective armor in this life is rarely forged from steel. Our greatest defense is always the beautiful, impenetrable mask we learn to wear. Gabriel pauses in the doorway, his hands stalling on his silk tie. He freezes, his dark eyes cataloging every inch of the human weapon he has methodically conditioned. The intensity of his fixation carries a suffocating weight. He glides behind her, his heavy hands locking onto her exposed waist. A single finger maps the vertebrae of her spine. He murmurs that the perimeter is secure, pressing a burning kiss behind her ear. We see the onset of Stockholm Syndrome here. She shivers, experiencing profound disgust at her own body for actively craving the warmth of her captor. Then he delivers the external stressor. Christian Moretti landed an hour ago. Her worst nightmare breathes the same air. It is a bitter reality of human behavior. You can attempt to outrun severe trauma for years, but it only takes one quiet night for the ghost to catch up. Gabriel turns her around, his face dripping with megalomaniac glory. The terrified enemy finally swallowed the bait. Stick with me here, because the clinical tension in this phase is staggering. Moretti is arriving to verify rumors of the returning heir. Clarissa engages complete emotional detachment, her face turning to stone. If recognized, she faces total extermination. With alarming calm, she conceals a titanium blade inside her purse. Gabriel displays a sadistic smirk, peeling back his tuxedo to expose the heavy iron strapped to his ribs. He whispers his intent to remind the city what happens when a predator is cornered. They step out, observing a ballroom swimming in synthetic smiles. As they descend the grand staircase, the room drops into absolute, chilling silence. The psychological lesson is clear. Genuine authority never has to raise its voice to make an entire room stop breathing. Every individual in that space pivots to track them. A suffocating wave of whispers washes over the crowd. Clarissa bears the trauma of her past like a crown. Maintaining a rigid posture and deadened eyes, Gabriel steers her through this ecosystem of sociopaths, entirely dismissing their hostile glares. He leans in close, mimicking the intimacy of a lover to mask his tactical briefing. He quietly notes that Ivanov is positioned at 2 o'clock. Clarissa lets her gaze drift. Viktor Ivanov stands paralyzed by the champagne tower, the blood draining from his scarred face. His cognitive processing finally catches up. He realizes exactly who she is. There is a brutal truth hidden in human pathology. You can run as far as geography allows, but your darkest transgressions will always hunt you down, right when you finally feel secure. Operating through pure dissociation, Clarissa flashes a symmetrical smile for the cameras, whispering a command to let the coward flee. Gabriel instructs her to maintain visual focus on the primary exit. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors are breached, and the ambient tension spikes. Flanked by 4 enforcers, Christian Moretti enters. He wears a white tuxedo jacket, a garment functioning as an arrogant behavioral dare to the criminal element. Christian sweeps his cold eyes over the room, dismissing the politicians, until his sweep locks onto Gabriel. Slowly, his gaze shifts to the traumatized ghost standing at the kingpin's side. The psychological reality here is one we constantly ignore. Severe arrogance is nothing but a loud, expensive defense mechanism attempting to shield a deeply terrified and fragile mind. Clarissa suppresses her blink reflex entirely. She locks eye contact with the aggressor who orchestrated the slaughter of her family. We witness a radical neurological shift. The agonizing fear she carried for 3 years evaporates, hijacked by a dark thirst for retaliation. Christian's smug expression collapses. Respiration ceases. He stares at her as if processing a hallucination, finally recognizing her amber eyes. He genuinely believed he had eradicated her genetic line. Gabriel exhibits a twisted smile, murmuring that the Grim Reaper just crashed the event. Christian enters an acute panic state, whispering to his enforcer, whose hand slips toward a concealed firearm. Clarissa verbally flags the threat without hesitation. If there is a clinical lesson in this violence, it is this: never underestimate a highly traumatized subject who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Notice the behavioral trust here. Gabriel does not turn to verify. He operates purely on her auditory signal the second she identifies a sniper on the balcony. He roars a command to drop, and the environment shatters. Before the marksman can engage, Gabriel elevates his sidearm and discharges 2 rounds into the ceiling. He severs a massive crystal chandelier directly above Christian's group. Bystanders enter autonomic panic as hundreds of pounds of sharp glass detonate against the floor. Clarissa throws herself behind a stone pillar, feeling the velvet of her garment tear. Gabriel is instantly there, utilizing his own mass as a biological shield while ballistics shred the room. The survival metric here is simple. When your environment violently collapses, placing absolute trust in the individual guarding your blind spot is the only path to survival. Muzzle flashes illuminate the velvet shadows of the decimated gala. Christian's men exhibit blind, reactive firing as Gabriel's unit breaches the doors, converting the space into a slaughterhouse. Gabriel locks onto her wrist, his vocal commands cutting through the auditory trauma, directing her toward the kitchen. Suddenly, a hostile combatant rises from the debris, targeting Gabriel's spine. Gabriel's weapon is depleted, the slide locking back with a sickening metallic click. You and I need to observe this exact microsecond carefully, because this is where Clarissa's psychological mutation finalizes. Displaying chilling psychomotor control, she reaches into her purse and draws the titanium blade. The behavioral truth is beautifully tragic. Meticulous preparation will always neutralize autonomic panic. You must always keep one quiet, fatal secret buried in the dark. We document her kinetic movement here. There is an agonizing efficiency that only manifests from a childhood steeped in violence. Clarissa operates with terrifying elegance, stepping into the light to drive the titanium instrument directly into the assailant's neck. She rotates the steel with clinical precision. The subject drops his rifle, asphyxiating as crimson paints the white linen. She extracts the blade, her pupils dilated with severe adrenaline, her dress saturated with blood. Gabriel simply studies her through smoke. The submissive assistant just executed a human target without a single micro-expression of remorse, and this realization irreversibly bonds his narcissism to her. It is a dangerous psychiatric reality. The individuals who generate the least noise usually carry the most lethal coping mechanisms. Always respect the quiet ones. They suppress the deepest storms. Gabriel anchors her against his accelerating heart rate, while his unit secures the compromised environment. Operating through an adrenaline spike, he manages a dark joke, instructing her to never to fetch his coffee again. Outside, police sirens tear through the freezing New York atmosphere, echoing violently off the concrete canyons of Fifth Avenue. He breaches the steel doors to the kitchen, dragging her into the oppressive heat. The staff has fled, leaving behind overturned carts and boiling pots that saturate the oxygen with the olfactory signature of mass panic. Let us pause our analysis and examine this variable together. It is completely irrelevant how much capital or systemic influence occupies a given space. Pure chaos acts as a universal behavioral equalizer. When lethal force is introduced, the expensive caviar inevitably mixes with the blood on the dirty floor. Let us examine the immediate aftermath of acute trauma. Down a dark alley on 61st Street, Gabriel violently forces Clarissa into the secure rear cabin of an armored vehicle. Hostile fire strikes the reinforced glass with immense kinetic force. The driver initiates a high-speed evasion into the chaotic grid of Manhattan traffic, leaving the compromised location behind. Inside this moving vault, their sympathetic nervous system response finally crashes, plunging them into a heavy, agonizing silence. You and I must recognize a clinical certainty here. Velocity might distance a subject from a physical threat, but the body always keeps the physiological score. Ultimately, every human mind must eventually reconcile with the quiet, devastating toll of its own survival. Observe Clarissa in this enclosed space. She collapses against the leather seating, her respiratory rate critically elevated. Her dress is saturated with the biological evidence of a lethal encounter. Her digits are locked around a small blade in titanic contraction, the knuckles devoid of blood. Gabriel initiates a gentle physical intervention. He encases her hands in his, extracting the weapon from her traumatized grip. He discards the blade, his vocal tone fracturing as he assesses her for penetrating trauma, his eyes conducting a frantic somatic survey. Clinically speaking, we see a profound behavioral manifestation here. Individuals who maintain the most rigid psychological defenses often merely require one secure external presence to finally release their grip. Clarissa regulates her oxygen intake with difficulty, issuing a denial of injury while staring at hands coated in biological matter. When she questions Christian's whereabouts, Gabriel exhibits profound disgust. He notes the subject fled while his subordinates were terminated. Christian has suffered a total collapse of his operational reality. The underworld now recognizes Clarissa is no longer a deceased anomaly. Meanwhile, the civilian population remains ignorant. By 3 in the morning, Gabriel's counsel is feeding law enforcement a sanitized narrative. This demonstrates a harsh sociological lesson. The historical record is invariably authored by those with the financial resources to manufacture the loudest truth. Masked by financial incentives, law enforcement categorizes the violent engagement as a generic robbery. The morning broadcast cycles absorb this fabrication entirely, preserving Gabriel's pristine public pathology. Yet, within the covert channels of the criminal syndicate, the factual data propagates rapidly. Every competing faction now registers that Gabriel has secured the final Romano descendant as his primary operational partner. He merely observes her from the shadows of the vehicle. The compliant assistant persona she maintained is permanently erased. You and I are witnessing a textbook psychological shedding. A subject can suppress their aggressive traits for years, but internal friction will always incinerate that false persona when the correct environmental trigger occurs. Visualize this clinical scenario with me. We have a subject coated in the violent residue of a man she just terminated without hesitation. Gabriel exhibits the classic predatory gaze of a megalomaniac narcissist, stating she preserved his life. Clarissa maintains a rigid, flattened affect. She rationalizes that her lethal action merely cancels the debt of his previous protection. But Gabriel closes the physical distance, his vocal registry dropping into a highly possessive frequency. He informs her that behavioral debts are irrelevant now, claiming absolute psychological ownership. Here is a fundamental lesson in trauma bonding. Genuine loyalty does not stem from a calculated ledger of favors. It is synthesized entirely in the crucible of surviving catastrophic violence together. Gabriel issues a profound psychological surrender, verbalizing that he belongs to her equally. Bypassing formal boundaries, he forces a physical connection, initiating a desperate, forceful kiss. This is not normative affection. It is the explosive release of 2 years of repressed emotional tension, heavily mirroring the mechanics of Stockholm Syndrome, where the captured subject bonds with their violent captor. The sensory environment is saturated with carbon discharge and acute adrenaline. Clarissa exhibits an immediate reciprocal response, gripping his damaged clothing. For 24 months, she maintained a highly controlled defensive posture. Now that cognitive barrier has completely failed. The lesson is absolute. Repressed drives will always demand violent expression. Gabriel secures her against his torso. The heavy ring on her finger presses into his tissue, a tactile anchor that their new codependency was forged in severe trauma. Regulating their respiration, they connect foreheads. Clarissa predicts Christian will refuse to internalize this defeat, hypothesizing he will retreat to Chicago to mobilize reinforcements. Gabriel merely produces an expression of supreme pathological confidence. He invites the escalation, noting the adversary lacks the cognitive framework to understand the predator he just provoked. Here is the psychological takeaway. Never miscalculate the terrifying efficacy of an aligned pathology. When 2 subjects merge their aggressive drives, they can withstand any hostility the environment generates. Gabriel articulates his counter-offensive. He mandates a morning assembly with the governing commission. They will fuse their fractured organizations, abandoning defensive posturing to strike directly at Christian. Clarissa absorbs this data fully, synchronizing with the magnetic pathology of the individual who catalyzed her transformation. Her avoidance behavior is terminated. Displaying a chilling affect, she verbally commits to the total destruction of his adversaries. The vehicle breaches the subterranean perimeter, heavy barriers sealing them from external scrutiny. Pay attention, because the clinical truth is striking. Psychological integration occurs the moment avoidance ceases. One must incinerate their learned helplessness to actualize their true aggressive capacity. Gabriel exits the transport, facilitating her extraction with ritualistic deference. Clarissa accepts his support, exhibiting elevated postural dominance. She radiates the freezing confidence of an apex operative assuming territorial control. The submissive iteration of her personality is clinically dead, replaced by a functioning sociopathy. She transitioned from a marginalized subordinate to a capable combatant, neutralizing targets in ruined formal wear. Their mutual psychological reinforcement is absolute. This provides our primary behavioral lesson. Never underestimate the latent capacity of a passive subject. Those who operate in the peripheral vision of society often possess the exact traits required to violently dismantle the existing hierarchy. You and I have examined this case file together, but we must remain objective as we conclude. Did any predictive models anticipate the hostility from the Moretti faction, or that lethal kinetic exchange in the lobby? Even a trained observer experiences an elevated pulse reviewing the data. If this psychological dissection engaged your analytical mind, register your approval of this file. Subscribe to capture our future examinations of pathological revenge cycles. Document your analysis in the comments regarding Clarissa reclaiming her behavioral autonomy. The central thesis of her survival mechanism is clear. You possess the sole authority over your own cognitive framing. Never permit a hostile environment to dictate your psychological baseline. Remain vigilant out there in the dark,